Well, good morning. Today is Sunday, October the 18th. And again, welcome back to the TheraCast show. Today's topic, of course, is the accelerated pace which international frameworks are evolving around the planet with regards to the regulation of controlled plant-based medicines. Of course, that includes cannabis and other, which we're going to chat about today. So I have a number of special guests with us this morning, and we're going to go starting from bottom around on clock. On introductions and where we're sitting today, starting with you, Marcus.
So hi guys, have a good morning to everybody. And I'm here this morning with you from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. Beautiful morning, we have a lot of sunshine, but then again, we always have sunshine in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm Marcus Ramkissoon. I'm a cannabis policy expert, and I've been fortunate enough to have assisted the governments in the Caribbean, most of the governments in the Caribbean, with their policy and legislation thus far regarding cannabis and hemp. So hopefully this morning, as we discuss further, we'll get into a little bit of that legislation, some of those fine points, and some great solutions, hopefully, towards legislation and regulation in other countries.
Thank you, Mark. Rob.
Good morning, everyone. It's Rob Laurie here. I'm calling from Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, just across from Vancouver, and it is a gray, rainy, cold, and blustery day in what we call the San Diego of Canada.
And I'm Vancouver Island. CEO of TheraCan International. Our Center of Excellence for Panama is right behind us. I keep that picture up because it has remained cloudy for months now, with the occasional intermittent sunshine, mostly rain, very, very heavy rain this year. So for those of you that are north of us, be prepared for an El Nino year. So enjoy your snow, because I will not from here. So sorry to pass that along to you. All right, on today's topic, we're going to divide up the globe into areas in which we're all operating. To talk about the accelerated pace with regards to regulatory development for plant-based medicines. From my perspective here in LATAM, we saw a lot of movement last year, repair of some legislation in the case of Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, finishing legislation with some success, of course, in Peru. And we here in Panama are happy to say that what was able to be accomplished in the first quarter of this year before COVID is finally back in front of the Assembly next week for second reading, and then motoring forward very quickly for medical cannabis. But let's just talk briefly from each of your perspectives. Again, with Marcus, in the Caribbean, we're starting to see accelerated passage of legislation for some of the island states that are suddenly seeing some economic opportunities. I wonder if you could share it. Go ahead.
We've seen, we've always been saying that lead in the Caribbean with cannabis and cannabis legislation, and it's absolutely not true. You know, as we see, most of the countries that have had legislation from way back in '96 with California, they continuously have to change their legislative framework, continue to change their regulation and modify it, and that's because there was always loopholes within their frameworks. Back in 2014. We had the St. Vincent and Grenadines government in the Caribbean pushing heavily with the CARICOM, which is the Caribbean Community Heads of Government. We have our own little community like Europe, if you want to call it this, in the Caribbean. And they put together a commission called the Commission on Marijuana, the Marijuana Commission. Their job was to go around from island to island within the region and do public consultations and government consultations and issue a report. They issued a report finally 4 years later in 2018. And the result of the report was basically advising the governments in the Caribbean that they should look at non-medical adult use regulations, which would then cover both medical needs and non-medical needs of the citizens in the regions regarding cannabis. As you guys know, and maybe some of the viewers won't know, so I'll point it out, all the countries that are signed on to the international drug treaties, there are 3 of them. And many countries are, most countries, I think it's 130 countries or so are signed on to date. They have to follow the guidelines that are set out regarding narcotics in that legislation. And that, especially the 1961 Single Convention, that piece of legislation is where most drug laws in most countries come from and is it's based on. So, and unfortunately, a lot of governments, when they were writing cannabis laws, they simply weren't aware of this. So many of them did not follow those guidelines and put their countries, their states out of compliance with these international treaties. St. Vincent, which is a unique island, surprisingly, as much as they pushed heavily for the Marijuana Commission to be set up and for decriminalization and all this to happen within the Caribbean, they were the first ones to reject the Commission's recommendation and decide, well, no, we're not looking at adult use at all. We're looking at medical entirely. Jamaica beat everyone in the sense of they did not wait on the CARICOM Commission report. They went ahead in 2014 and they started putting forward their legislation. And by 2015, they had issued their legislation on cannabis. And unfortunately, a lot of it was missing. There were no export regulations. There were no regulations for tracking and monitoring, which the latter especially being the core of regulation regarding cannabis, it being itself a narcotic and a scheduled and controlled drug. So since then, we've seen Jamaica reiterate their regulations a few times, number of changes. They still have not executed a commercial export. They've been saying publicly, and I know a lot of viewers might think, but we've seen in the news that Jamaica has been exporting to Canada. Well, they've been exporting under research exports, which any country can do with any law, whether it's illegal or not, with proper guidance from government, of course. And a research export is usually like point something of a gram up to maybe a few grams, but they're using the maximum allowed amount, which is 10 kilograms, and doing 10 kilogram research exports to Canada. So up till today, with 2020, nearly the end of 2020, Jamaica has not exported commercially. The other islands so far, I mentioned Jamaica, I mentioned St. Vincent. St. Vincent now has their medical cannabis regulations, and they've just put out regulations for dispensaries. But they have yet to issue export, testing, and research, anything. Antigua and Barbuda in 2018 was able to pass their medical cannabis laws, and they already had decriminalized 15 grams, making it legal in effect to have 15 grams in the island. And up to today, unfortunately, they're still putting their tracking and monitoring system in place, and so soon no licenses have been issued, although there are about a dozen applicants. St. Kitts and Nevis also, which is an island right next to Antigua, they were able to institute their decriminalization laws last year, and they have their medical bill before them, but they haven't put it to parliament. Barbados has passed their legislative laws for medical cannabis and working on regulations. And Trinidad and Tobago, my country, has just decriminalized in December, allowing for 30 grams. It's a little synopsis. Sorry if it was a little long, but let's see. Best synopsis I can.
That's good, Marcus, because again, it shows in the last 3 years at least, we're starting to see an accelerated pace in the sense that each of these countries, though it's taken its own path, are starting to line up, which is good. The other thing too, of course, is that the island states are some of the first, before we chat with Rob about Canada's accelerated pace here as well, but some of the island states have been moving very quickly into other plant-based medicines, including psilocybin mushrooms. St. Vincent and the Grenadines SVG, for example, is very hot and heavy on getting into mushrooms as well. Then it all comes down to the traceability to be able to export it, because ultimately what they want to be able to do, other than being a tourist destination, is to get this into the hands of other foreign countries, right, and be able to export it.
Medical companies especially, right?
Right. So just quickly, with regards to the temperament of the Caribbean states, what is the general consensus with regards to either including in existing legislation or having to build brand new frameworks for other plant-based medicines? I'd be interested in their approach before we talk to Rob and Ken. Go ahead.
Now, the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms in the Caribbean was not really widespread. Yes, people use it. Like in Trinidad, we knew in our late, let's say after 20s and early 20s that, where we can find this type of mushroom and what time of the year. And some people might go picking, and then maybe you'd find it on the illicit market. But it wasn't a thing. It wasn't a fad. It wasn't something that we'd do. I was actually pretty surprised that when I first went to Jamaica, think somewhere back in 2008 or somewhere around there, and to learn that the Rastafari individuals who spiritual organization that considers cannabis a sacrament and so forth, that they use mushrooms occasionally. So and it is a fad among young people in Jamaica. So that was, and I guess that's due to their high tourist trade, right? I haven't seen it on the other islands. What I've encountered in terms of government response, I've tried to put it into the legislative framework in Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts, Trinidad, and well, indirectly through Barbados. And all those, everybody stepped back. They're afraid of it. It's like, what are you talking about? Are you crazy? How can you, we're talking about cannabis here after decades, and all of a sudden you want to put mushrooms in here. What's going on? So, and they're very, very afraid of it, more so than they are of cannabis, because of course they have way less information on it. The information they have in it is rudimentary in the sense of what a young person going through the forest to pick mushrooms might have, meaning, a lot of these things can be toxic and poisonous.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, especially in this hemisphere. When I lived in Russia, many of the common strains of mushroom that are in Rob's backyard in Vancouver, they are identical, but the ones in Canada are toxic, whereas the ones in Russia are commonly picked. And there was quite a higher incidence of Russian immigrants in Canada poisoning themselves mistakenly. So yeah, I get that part. But on the overall framework, and I want to jump to Rob here as well. What I am seeing globally is the unwillingness to include psilocybin or ayahuasca or peyote into a common regulatory framework, a single piece of regulation. In fact, they're very dead set in carving these into verticals. So we're going to have to get another license for this, another license for this, another license for this, effectively for the same locations in the capital cost of a government. Then trying to manage all of that with independent inspectors is probably going to become very unwieldy very quickly, which means that in some near future event, we'll all have to coalesce into yet another common piece of legislation. So Rob, with that up in Canada, you were on the forefront of cracking the dike of pent-up demand for psilocybin mushrooms with no legal supply for the country. How's that going, and where do you see this rolling up into the fourth piece of legislation already for cannabis, which, by the way, celebrated a birthday yesterday, ACMPR.
Yeah, 2 years of legalization. I mean, legalization was just another day for me. Yesterday was just another day. It's interesting, you see the Canadian Cannabis Council of Canada has issued themselves a report card on the legal industry. And it's quite funny, in some of the areas like support for Canadian legalization, they claim there's a B+ grade for that. Whereas, well, medical patient access is recognized as a D. And cannabis amnesty, a D on the report card, but yet government leadership gets a B+. Research, development, and innovation, D. Yeah. So again, I take issue with our legalization. On one hand, it's great, Canada stepped up, but a lot of it has been done under, I think, quite a very disingenuous guise of, on the back of medical. Well, medical patient access with legalization is actually worsened. We have a two-tiered system in Canada with medical and recreational, and much of the licensed medical producers, if they could sell their product at a greater price to Germany, they'll do it before putting it into the medical system. So ultimately, it was based on the back of roughly 15 years in Canada and 20 years in the US of medical access litigation, right? Which effectively got us to where governments were able to have this discussion of legalization without worrying about the United States closing the border, which ironically is still closed
anyways.
Right? Nothing to do with cannabis. But actually with these border closures, you're seeing a lot more demand, or not demand, but product making it, well, it's more difficult for product to get across the border. So you're seeing a lot more of these large scale busts because of, well, I guess the smuggling can't hide in the numbers or the volume crossing the border with COVID. Right. But ironically, justice and law enforcement got a B+ on this report card, and it says broad community compliance with legislation is recognized. Well, that's called the law. 85% of Canadians demonstrate a strong awareness of the risks of driving under the influence. I mean, it doesn't even say in the report card that justice and law enforcement has anything to do with driving, right? But yet it then says, similarly, fewer Canadian cannabis consumers report an interaction with law enforcement related to driving under the influence. I mean, with all due respect, that really says nothing about cannabis. It just talks about driving under the influence, which was that ever a problem in the first place with cannabis? Of course, mixing cannabis with alcohol, different kettle of fish. But I don't know. 2 years into legalization in Canada, I still have very mixed opinions on the success of the program. And in Canada, just to, I guess, for the viewers that are tuning in internationally, the federal government has the lion's share of the licensing power with respect to the issuance of cannabis licenses and who can produce. Right. Which means the provinces, ultimately a BC industry, which is, BC bud, BC cannabis, ultimately now is a subservient industry to Ontario. I mean, what other licenses in British Columbia do we have to go to Ottawa for licenses? We certainly don't for forestry, film, mining. I mean, Alberta does not go to Ontario for a drilling and oil license. Why do we need this with cannabis? Well, that's because the federal government has the lion's share of who can do what, which actually accounts for some of the failures. And I'll turn it over to you, Chris, in a second. But the distribution of retail cannabis and medical access, because of this, if you will, a division between federal on one hand and the provinces on the other, and the provinces have the power to decide how cannabis is distributed and sold within the province. And because of this disconnect between sale and distribution at the provincial level and the production, cultivation, and licensing at the federal level, it means that there's cannabis being produced, but it isn't always getting to market in a manner which is as efficient, as timely, and, well, the cost is still much cheaper regardless of what these reports say in the black market. I mean, very simply, during COVID and over the last year, I've got a good network on both sides of the fence. And, well, on the gray to black side of the fence, I ask, are you seeing your prices go up? Are you seeing your volume go down? And it's the opposite. Mm-hmm. Volume is going up and, well, prices are going down. And I don't think those numbers yet have been factored into this Canadian success story of legalization. I mean, it's the first G7 country. Great. But every other nation, as Marcus pointed out, which is yet to, or which is in the process of considering legalization, yes, there's elements they need to take from Canada, such as, the regulatory, licensing, compliance, feedstock, but they need to figure out how and adopt what will work for their local jurisdictions. So it's kind of a hot mess still.
Well, luckily
TheraCann and, our team and the work that Marcus is doing and working with us, we should be able to solve much of these problems, but there's still a lot of them.
Yeah, our approach from the get-go and being the old federal prosecutor of those restricted controlled substances and seeing how ridiculous that was being managed, have always taken the approach that all of what's in the schedule could be managed effectively under one framework. At the end of the day, it's public safety, and at the end of the day,
drug.
At the end of the day, the government wants its pound of tax, And right now under COVID, they need both. One, you don't want to put any more people in the hospital than you want to because it's an adulterated product. On the other hand, you got to make money. And these states are desperate for cash, and many of them are going bankrupt in the next couple of years. As we wander our way out of COVID, it's going to be a nightmare economically for quite a number of them unless they can get into the game quickly. The challenge is,
well, and that Chris is, and maybe Marcus, you can again opine just from the Caribbean side of things, but if you fail to include the illicit market and provide for an ability for mom and pops from the main street right up to Wall Street to participate in an industry, well, those will be your biggest competitors and the folks that undermine and are the ones that won't be paying the tax. But ironically, they're the ones that would if there was a way to be included in the system that didn't involve.
I agree with you ethically, right?
Oh, good.
And personally, right, from my own personal experience, yes. However, coming from a regulatory standpoint and a political approach, what I mean by a political approach is a government is supposed to be responsible for all citizens, not any particular group. Okay?
I like the supposed to.
Yeah, and I know your viewers would know, but I do many things, and I have my own small little political party that's a symbol.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah,
and I've contested our elections a few times, so I sort of try to think like that, maybe from an idealist perspective, but realistically, if a government is looking at all individuals and trying to help as many citizens as possible, it is not fair legally to include or exclude any particular group.
Right. 100%.
And in any country, from our very, very tiny countries here in the Caribbean with 40,000 citizens in St. Kitts and those islands up to a few million and then further up. Even in some courses that I'm doing now that's based out of Massachusetts, and questions that how are you going to satisfy the need for so many licenses? Are you going to issue as a state, a jurisdiction, a country, thousands of cannabis licenses? Cannabis will be like any other product in the market. It's not going to be a
commodity. At the end of the day, it's a commodity. And
as much as the people who were intake before and those of low economic standing, and everyone deserves a chance, which is the same with water. Today, how many people do you see actually engaging in the business of water? It's because any consumer product, and this will include cannabis, has to follow so many regulations for health and safety that operations to manufacture, process any of these products are usually very costly. So what I've always been advising both governments and public is for the government side to put within their legislation social equity clauses, which not only say, well, if you're within a low economic standing or within this group, you can individually apply for a license. The difference is you can apply and the government will assist and all this stuff, great social equity plan, but you must apply with a group of maybe no less than 50 individuals.
Well, that's a good point, Mark. It's like let's shift to the other side of the hemisphere just to share some different perspectives there. So we have a very important outcome today coming out of New Zealand. The vote was yesterday. I'm still waiting for the results, but we'll know whether or not it's legalized for recreational use.
Well, the Prime Minister got voted back in.
Yeah. Well, that again, they've been in coalition governments for quite some time, so good to see a little bit of consistency. Whereas Australia is still very much roll of the dice. But I'd be very interested to see their approach, and they have a very aggressive Department of Health. Their advancement from what started as R&D to medical and now recreational, ultimately veterinarian, is moving very, very quickly to outpace the Australian market. So that's encouraging. But if I look at Africa and our work in Zimbabwe, South Africa, in Lesotho, they went quite the opposite. Everyone and anyone could go get a license effectively. There was a fee to a license. And certainly in the Northeast South Africa, they very much want the subsistence farmers to have their own, to be able to go do what they do best, which is grow out on a very small plot of land. The problem is there's no infrastructure for them, and they'll remain as a subsistence farmer. There's no real ability for them to coalesce and aggregate volumes to get it into a meaningful way that raises the value of the product to actually get money into their hands. So it's got a ways to go, and it's unfortunate that everyone seems to kind of throw a rock at it from the government's perspective, rather than say, let's really sit down and look at what worked really well and what can be country interoperable, so we can begin this process of international trade in a way that's meaningful. Now, we talked about Germany today. One of the big stories last week is Uruguay finally under its self-repair, because that was a disaster 4 years ago. But they were able to export to Portugal. Portugal, obviously, back up into Germany through Tilray, which is, 10 minutes drive for where you're sitting there, Rob. Their office in
I hope
Portugal.
not.
Yeah, from
It's
their
like
office.
more like 20. It's over by Harmac in the
Okay.
commercial industrial end of town. I'm in North Nanaimo.
Okay, well, I worked with Tilray from day one, so I know what that was all about. But the thing is
Duke Road.
what's been interesting is they were able to get it up and over as a CGMP product, but that was a very difficult, arduous route. And ultimately, they were able to get it over there for $11 a gram dried, but that's the lowest common denominator product. It's not going in as oil. It's not going in as finished. It's just dried flour, right? So there's going to be a lot to chat about, I would imagine, to the end of the year and into next. This team here, thankfully, has got its finger on the pulse all the way around the globe. We are very much wanting to get frameworks that are repeatable, economic, practical, scalable, safe and secure, but do it in a way that makes sense, right? And I think the period of experimentation over the last 7 years has got to stop, right? I still mind boggle when we get a call out of the wilderness to come help with legislation as if they're the first country to do this, right? And you have to explain, well, you're like number 56, 57, 58. And there's a lot that can be done to avoid the mistakes of governments past. And, just handing out licenses willy-nilly like South Africa, which is now retracting those licenses. Zimbabwe, the Minister of Health reached out and asked for proof of how they're going to be in production next year and what's that going to look like, or lose their license. And because they're frustrated as hell. They were doing budget planning on stuff that never materialized, right? And in an economy that's so constrained right now for capital, getting these projects up and running quickly and generating revenue is going to be imperative. So the purpose of today was to flag and highlight, and we'll do a quick roundtable sum up here as we're running out of time. But the point of our roundtable here is we are working with best in class companies and individuals like on this call who really can bring a lot to the table. And for anyone watching or listening that would like to learn more, obviously reach out to us. We'd be happy to assist. But I wonder I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes roundup for each of you guys, but what are your predictions for 2021 in terms of government rollouts? And that's all I'm going to say, whatever comes top of mind, starting with you, Marcus. What are you looking forward to in 2021?
Well, I mean, we've seen what's happening with COVID. No one at this point is able to predict when things are going to be eased and restrictions and all that. And it has been affecting the economy and business on all levels and different levels. I would say that many countries, at least in my region, and even maybe in the countries of Africa, you may see less restrictions on cannabis as countries seek to, again, gain more revenue, right, within this hard time. So hopefully now might be a good time for advocacy groups to petition their governments, petition their legislators to look into making these changes now, because it can bring a lot of revenue to their country very quickly if they do it correctly. I just want to disagree very quickly with something you said, Robert, when it came to use of cannabis and driving. Of course, some seasoned users may forget what it's like the first time, even myself, but I want a first-time user of cannabis operating a vehicle on the road, or an infrequent user.
Oh, I agree. But
Probably.
look back when we were teenagers, right? The first
No,
time we were getting offered cannabis, alcohol was in the equation. And of course, when you combine alcohol, the point I was trying to make, which I don't think I did as well as I should have, when you combine cannabis with alcohol, the effects are enhanced. But of course, to the inexperienced first-time user, just cannabis alone, I want to stress and reiterate that yes, you shouldn't be operating heavy machinery, driving a vehicle, or putting yourself or anyone else in harm's way, which comes back to the importance of, with cannabis, just as with any other entheogenic medicine, of setting and intention. But I think there was a lot of fear mongering, at least in cannabis, about how we couldn't possibly legalize cannabis because the United States would shut us down and that we would have death on the highways, and hence all these machines like the Draeger 3000 wouldn't work.
Well, let's not out on that. From prosecutor's point of view, the impaired driving, that's the only charge that I ever saw come out for cannabis, represented less than 2% of all of my driving offenders. It was all alcohol or heavy opioids. Cannabis wasn't a problem. Right.
It's actually a bigger topic in our region and in the discussions that I've been a part of in terms of government, in terms of their concern. And my advice that I'd like to put forward quickly is don't look at the breathalyzers and all these crazy devices, because those are chemical screening. Sure. Yeah. There are a lot of false positives and false negatives. And as a government institute or legislator, that can only open up a country to challenges in court, basically, when it comes to charges. What I do advise, there is, I won't say what it is here yet, but you can contact Terracan to find out. There is an impairment detection device. It's already been tested. It's being used by one government now, and it literally detects impairment. You still have to do chemical screening afterwards to determine what the drug or substance was, but it will detect impairment for anything. And it's an amazing device. It's what all countries should be using. And even companies shouldn't just be looking at, countries shouldn't just be looking at DUI. They should be looking at OUI, operating under the influence laws also. Because you don't want your surgeon being an infrequent user of cannabis, having a talk with his friend in the morning and coming to do a surgery. Okay,
well, so agreed. But on my prediction side, we're seeing unprecedented incidents of depression, suicidal depression, as well as anxiety. The recent Canadian poll showed that on anxiety, we're 4x what it was pre-COVID, and on suicidal depression, we're 2x. These are in the hundreds of thousands of individuals that, one, don't have ready access to, we'll call it medicine that could be helping them, or at least a recreational product that has a lot fewer side effects, the least of which being addiction, that others have, and could quite honestly be getting it in a form that's safe and won't cause other problems on consumption. And for a government with a very limited health budget right now, being able to get a product that's cheap has got to be top of mind. So my prediction is over the next couple of years, we're going to see a resurgence in interest, and we're going to see a backlash from the opioid companies. Are going to see that dip into their revenues. And so we're going to get a lot of flack, is my prediction, over the next couple of years from the J&Js and the Glaxos, and yes, I'm not trying to slander them in any sense of the way, but there is a history of their being very aggressive in the markets in which they produce, and there is a direct correlation between where we're seeing their largest production to their countries being the last to introduce legislation for cannabis, for example, another plant-based medicine. So that's my prediction. Rob, you're chafing at the bit.
My quick predictions. I think 2021 is going to be a gangbuster year because government, society, we're running out of room, right? It's the dam's going to bust. You've got these amazing studies in Canada with Dr. Kovalchuk, where perhaps it could even be determined that cannabis plays a role in mitigating some of these international viral infections. And well, the science, the evidence-based approach is only going to continue to exonerate cannabis, and that's exciting because then we can really get down to how to study this plant, how to provide medical solutions which have always been there. They just now need to be reincorporated back into society on a social, cultural, and I dare say a ceremonial level, looking at our indigenous and local traditions. So 2021, we're going to get out of the storm. It's going to be a rocky ride, but it is through out of extremities that we can shake the shackles of the previous legislation and rules and look at the future, hopefully with a fresh set of eyes, because to fail to do so is only going to put humanity and society of all of our regions that we're representing today on this call continue to limit the advancement of what needs to happen.
And that's a wrap. We're right at the end of our time. I look forward to having another chat with us again, guys. We only touched the thin edge surface of what we know, and there's parts of Oceania that we never even got a chat about, or Europe. So we'll save that for another day. Thank you so much. Happy Sunday. Thank you for the TheraCann chat, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks to everyone.
Okay, ciao, ciao.